Dream Vision 7 Radio Network welcomes Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes, heard every Monday at 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Using nearly 200 years of abundant and consistent afterlife evidence, quantum physics, consciousness research, and ancient writings, we seek to understand who and what we are, how reality works, the nature of God, and the meaning and purpose of our lives. Join Roberta weekly to better understand our one reality and gain insights into how we can make the most of the glorious eternal beings that we are.
Welcome to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Joyous conversations about what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about our one reality. You have nothing to fear. You are eternal and you are perfectly loved. Knowing the truth changes everything. Now, here's Roberta.
Welcome to Seek Reality. I'm Roberta Grimes, and I'm delighted that you can be with us today. One of the best practical handbooks on expanding your consciousness and growing spiritually is T.J. Woodward's Conscious Being, Awakening to Your True Nature. And it came out in 2015. It's not even recent, but I found this book so astonishing I have to recommend it to you. It reaches the same conclusions that I've reached in all my study of the afterlife evidence, in all my study of the Gospels. It reaches all the same conclusions, but it reaches them from the viewpoint of Eastern traditions, which to me is really kind of amazing. I interviewed TJ a few years ago talking about his book, and this is the only time I think I've ever done this. I loved the book so much that I spent a good part of the interview just reading bits of it to TJ rather than talking to him about what he thought. I just was bursting with loving his book. So again, I really recommend that you read TJ's Conscious Being. T.J. Woodward is a loving and compassionate spiritual teacher. He serves as the senior minister and spiritual director of Agape Bay Area in Oakland, California, which is the first satellite community of the Agape International Spiritual Center in L.A. Boy, I can see why they chose him for that. He's long been interested in addiction, and he'll talk about why he was so interested when we begin to have our conversation. And he's been working as a spiritual care person at various leading addiction treatment programs for more than a decade. He's the creator of the Conscious Recovery Method. He's trademarked it, which is a groundbreaking approach to viewing and treating addiction, a new way of looking at it. His latest book, no surprise, is Conscious Recovery, a fresh perspective on addiction. And all of this is so timely because our nation is in the midst of an explosion in addictions, including addictions to opioids, that's frankly ravaging many communities and sidelining people in what should be their most productive years. I'm going to be learning with you because I don't know anything about addiction, well, except addiction to chocolate. I can talk about that. But other than that, I know nothing about addictions. So, TJ, we are all ears. Welcome back to Seek Reality, and I'm so delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Roberta. I am so delighted to be in conversation with you. I remember our last interview 3 years ago. What I walked away with from that interview was how much fun you and I had together. So
we really
forward
did.
to that happening again today.
Yes, we're going to have a ball with what is really not a fun topic, but it's a very, very important topic. You began to be an addict in your teens. Can you talk about that? Tell us how that happened.
Well, early in my life, it's interesting. I have to go back a little bit, and this really sets the stage for how I've come to view addiction through really, I think, a different lens. I'm not going to say I'm the only one looking at it in this way, but I have a unique perspective because of my own experience. I remember being a very small child and being absolutely in awe of the world, so happy, so open-hearted, so in the moment. I remember this experience of absolute joy. And I also remember the experience of that closing down, that shutting down, that closing off of that experience. I remember losing that joy, losing that presence, losing that heartedness. And that was at age 7, which set the stage for addiction that came in my teenage years.
So it started because you were a joyous child, and that was taken from you?
Well, the reason I start with that story is I remember at age 7 very distinctly shutting down and closing off and becoming afraid of the world. And I walked around that way with this sense of disconnection. My heart felt closed. I felt very afraid of the world, which was such a sharp contrast to the first 7 years of my life. So I absolutely believe it's connected with my addiction, because at age 13 or 14, when I drank for the first time and I used drugs for the first time, I experienced relief from that at that time.
Do you know what caused you to shut down? What was the event, or was there no event? Was it you just didn't feel that you fit in somehow?
Well, it was a combination of things, I think. It's interesting that you're asking those questions, because in my book, I identify different root causes of addiction, and one of them is spiritual disconnection. And what I mean by that spiritual disconnection is a separation from that essential self. There were things happening in the world and in my life that were very terrifying for me. It's not that I can say it was this one thing. It was really more that I recognized that I came into a world where there was competition, where there was good and bad and right and wrong, and all of this violence happening in the world. And I think my spiritual self, it was almost too much for me to experience that kind of pain and suffering. So I had an unconscious or an automatic response to shut down and protect myself.
Okay, well, that's I can understand that, and especially I think when people can't, there isn't an adult they can talk with or an older sibling who they trust. It can feel very lonely to be a young child, a small child. So you started then to seek relief from this, and you say at 14 you discovered alcohol.
Yeah, somewhere around age 13 or 14. And then, drugs crept into the picture over time. And, in the beginning, to be clear, in the beginning, it was very much a relief from this sense of brokenness, this sense of disconnection. And it really seemed to work for a while. And then, of course, it's not a long-term solution, of course, to spiritual disconnection and shame and all these feelings I was experiencing. I remember thinking about, I look back and I look at a small child and look at the joy that they have that's inherent in their experience. And I am just reminded of how it can be so difficult to be such a loving being in this world. And so a lot of us, I think, in one way or another, close off.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, that's deep, and I think that's an important message for parents, because your children may as well be having issues at school or in their personal lives, or just in not feeling like, they sort of feel like a square peg in a round hole in some ways. And I think it's important I'm a mother and a grandmother. It's important to be very alert for that, because especially if our lives seem okay, it can be easy, I think, to push aside the issues in our children's lives. Apparently, that's not the right solution. The right solution is to get children counseling and help very early if they seem to be shutting down the way TJ did. Because if you don't get them help, clearly they're going to get help of their own, and it may be the wrong kind of help. So the first thing you learned about addiction then is that it's good in the beginning, but it doesn't stay good. It doesn't really satisfy whatever it is that drove you to become an addict in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I frame in the conscious recovery method and in my book, Conscious Recovery, I look at addiction not as the problem. I think we have a tendency to look at it and say, addiction is bad and how do we get rid of it?
Right.
The Western medical model really just adds to that, saying, what are your symptoms? How do I eradicate them? So I'm looking at addiction as a solution to something that feels broken within. And when we become curious about what it is that we're wanting to medicate rather than the addiction itself, I think that's a very powerful point of change, because we can look for the answers within rather than trying to fix it through symptoms and behaviors. And
that is such an important point. This is the problem with Western science. 100+ years ago, the decision was made to become materialist. And believe it or not, this is a dogma. They turned science into a religion in the early part of the 20th century so they wouldn't have to look at all the evidence that they were getting that, in fact, people are eternal. There's something big going on. And even the work that was done by the great quantum physicists who most of the good ones came to the same conclusion: consciousness is all that exists. Even that didn't sway, and to this day has not swayed, this peculiar obsession science has with everything being material. I mean, if you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you are someone who only thinks in terms of medication and physical treatment of illnesses, you'll never notice that virtually always, wouldn't you say, TJ, the illness is something which is spiritual? It's really not physical. And that's why we just had someone on to talk about spiritual healing, Joyce Stewart. The problem is that spiritual healing is like 100 times, according to the great quantum biologist Bruce Lipton, 100 times more effective than chemicals. But still, because the way medicine and science work, because all they can see is material stuff, so many people are suffering. And what you're saying is, even in the treatment of addiction, if you don't go after the spiritual stuff, you can't treat and you can't solve the addiction problem.
Absolutely. Now I'm excited because I love this part of the conversation. I open a conversation in the beginning of my book about what there's an Indian proverb that says we're like a house with 4 rooms: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And if you look at addiction and addiction treatment, so much focus, as you said so beautifully, is focused on the physical. And although we don't want to deny that that's an experience, it will only take us so far if we're only treating the physical. And what we get stuck in is a pattern of trying to eradicate symptoms. That's not the deeper issue. The deeper issue, in my experience and in my framework, is a spiritual issue. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is there's no surprise that right now we're experiencing high levels of addictive behavior because we come into this world and we're getting taught all sorts of things that are counter to our spiritual truth. So we look at the spiritual piece, which to me is a connection with that essential self. And in the quantum world, as you said, the observer has a profound effect. So if we're going in and looking for what's wrong, we're going to find more of what's wrong. If we're going in and offering a framework that says, let's look at this through the lens of spiritual wholeness, something powerful can begin.
Yes, so profound.
I ended up in a place of absolute inner bankruptcy. That's the way I will frame it. My last year of my drinking and using, I was 20 years old. I ironically got sober about 50 days before my 21st birthday, so before I could legally drink. And there
are ironies in this world, aren't there?
And that last year was just an experience of being so empty, so devoid of connection, so much shame, so much feeling of brokenness. It was as if, this is the way I say it, it was as if I had my umbilical cord in my hand and I was trying to plug into anyone or anything to try to feel whole again, all the while feeling more and more empty and just on this desperate search outside because I felt so broken inside. And a friend of mine had gotten sober, and he invited me to come to these different groups he was going to that were helping him with that. And there was something within me that said, yes, this is a yes. And that was that inner knowing, that inner guidance system. What I want to say about that, though, is it actually took me 6 months to actually reconnect with him and then show up and start getting into recovery. And what I want to share for a moment here is a profound life-changing moment. I met a woman named Mary Helen Brownell. I dedicate both my books to her. She's a person who changed my life because she was the first person that I had experienced in, as long as I could remember, maybe ever in my life, that really had the ability to see through all of the pain and the shame and could see me as spiritually whole. So she was a person that really helped me begin this path toward recovering or toward returning to my essential wholeness.
Wow. And what is her profession? What is it that she's a counselor?
She was a counselor. I did not meet her through that. She had retired by the time I met her, but she had been a drug and alcohol counselor for people returning from the Vietnam War. So she had worked with a lot of people who were coming out of that horrific experience, working through multiple layers of trauma and shame, which is, it leads us into how I've come to the deeper root causes